My name is Tamsin. I'm 33 years old, and 6 months after my divorce, I bought the beach house my sister had been saving for since she was 22. She found out on a Tuesday. She called me crying. I let it ring twice before I answered. But before I tell you about that phone call, I need to take you back to a Sunday dinner in February, because that is where this story actually begins. That is the night I understood something that took me 3 years of marriage to learn and one humiliating dinner to confirm. Some people do not celebrate your success. They only tolerate it when it makes them look good by association. The moment it stops doing that, they need you to fail. I drove to my parents' house that Sunday, still wearing the clothes I had put on that morning with the specific intention of looking fine. Black trousers, a gray jumper I had owned for 4 years, flat boots, the outfit of someone who has decided that looking fine is the most honest available performance when fine is not what you are. The divorce had been final for 11 weeks. My mother opened the door with the expression she had been wearing toward me since October, a kind of careful warmth that was really a kind of careful distance. The warmth of someone who loves you but finds your current situation embarrassing and has not yet found the language to separate those two things. Come in, sweetheart. Everyone is already here. Everyone. I noted the specific use of everyone to establish that I was the last to arrive, the one whose timing required acknowledgement. The dining room smelled like Sunday roast and my father's cologne and the specific ambient tension of a family gathering that has been running for an hour before the difficult member arrives. My sister Imogen was already seated. She looked up when I came in with the expression she had been perfecting since we were children, the expression of someone who is very glad to see you, and also very aware of how much better things are going for her than for you, and is managing both of those feelings simultaneously. Her husband, Rupert, was beside her, scrolling his phone with a half-present energy of a man who has learned that family dinners require physical attendance, but not full engagement. My father stood and hugged me the way fathers hug daughters when they are not sure what the right amount of pressure is for the current circumstances. Good to see you, Tamsin. You too, Dad. I sat across from Imogen. If you enjoy stories about the kind of quiet that builds into something the room did not see coming, you are in the right place. This is Revenge Cold Stories. Subscribe before we go any further, and tell me your first name and your city in the comments. I want to know who is sitting with me tonight. Now, let me take you back further. I married Giles Thorne at 27. He was 32. Commercial property. The kind of man who fills a room with the easy confidence of someone who has always been exactly the right kind of impressive. My mother loved him within 40 minutes of meeting him, which should have been information, but which I interpreted at the time as validation. The first 2 years were good in the way that things are good when two people are still performing their best versions of themselves for each other. We went to the right places. We attended the right events. We built the right version of a life that looked, from outside, like people mean when they say you are doing well. My father told me once that year that Giles was the kind of man who would take care of me. I was a financial analyst at a healthcare consulting firm making more than Giles at the time. I did not say that. I said, "Thank you," and passed the bread. That should have been information too. The third year was when the performance started to cost more than it was producing. Giles had opinions about how I dressed for his company events, specific opinions, delivered not as criticism but as suggestion, which was how he delivered most things he had already decided. He would say something like that, "Dress is maybe a little casual for the Cavendishes." And what he meant was, "Wear the other one." He would say, "Maybe let me handle the Sinclair conversation tonight." And what he meant was, "Do not express that opinion in front of people whose approval matters to me." I did not see it clearly at first. That is the thing I want to be precise about, because it would be easy to make this a story about a terrible man. And that is not what it was. Giles was not terrible. He was a man who had a very clear idea of what a successful life looked like, and an equally clear idea of the role a wife played in maintaining that picture. He was not trying to diminish me. He genuinely did not notice that he was doing it because, in his framework, I was a component of a successful presentation rather than a person with a separate interior life that the presentation was obscuring. By year 4, I had stopped bringing work conversations home because the way he responded to them made me feel like I was reporting to someone rather than talking to a partner. By year 5, I had a wardrobe that had been quietly curated by someone else's preferences and a social calendar organized entirely around his professional relationships and a habit of checking his expression before I finished a sentence in public. My sister Imogen called this a beautiful marriage. She said it at my kitchen table one afternoon, looking around at the granite worktops and the Smeg fridge and the view of the courtyard from the window. "You two are so solid." She said it the way people say things they want to be true about someone else's life because it confirms something about the choices they have made about their own. "Rupert and I are solid too, but it is nice to see it in other couples." I said, "Thank you," and refilled her coffee. I did not say that the night before Giles had told me in a voice that was not raised and not unkind that I had made the conversation with the Montgomerys awkward by mentioning my own project and that we needed to talk about how I engaged at these dinners. Imogen saw the granite and decided she understood the marriage. She did not understand the marriage. The divorce was my decision. I want to be clear about that because the family's version, which developed quickly and was maintained consistently, was that the divorce had happened to me, that I had failed to maintain something I should have maintained, that Giles had been a good husband and I had been somehow insufficient or unreasonable or too difficult or not quite enough of whatever the specific quality was that good wives possessed, and I had not. The actual reason was quieter than anything they could have turned into a story. I came home one evening in September and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. And I thought with the specific clarity of someone who has been avoiding a thought for a very long time and can no longer find a direction to avoid it, in that I was exhausted in a way that sleep did not fix. That the exhaustion was structural. That it lived in the specific energy required to be the right version of myself in every room of my own house. I called a solicitor the next morning. The financial process was unpleasant in the procedural way that financial processes are unpleasant when two people have built a life together and are now separating its components. Accounts unfrozen, assets split, the house sold in March, both of us taking our shares, both of us moving out with the particular efficiency of people who are trying to be civilized and are succeeding technically if not emotionally. I moved into a small flat in Swindon with 100 square meters and a view of a multi-story car park and more quiet than I had had in 6 years. My mother's first response to the divorce was to ask what Giles's family would think. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened? What will his family think?" I said I did not know and that I found I could not locate the part of myself that cared as much as she did. She looked at me with the expression that meant I was being difficult, the same expression she had been using since I was 14, and had opinions that were inconvenient. The Sunday dinner in February was 11 weeks after the divorce finalized. I had been to 2 family gatherings since then, and both had had the same ambient quality. Careful warmth that was really careful distance. Questions that were shaped like concern but were really shaped like assessment. Is she coping? Is she stable? Is she embarrassing us, or is she managing it? I was managing it. What they did not understand was that managing it was not the same as struggling, that the quiet in my flat was not the quiet of loss. It was the first quiet I had had in years, and I was learning to live inside it with something that felt cautiously like relief. The dinner was Sunday roast and bread rolls and a bottle of red my father had opened too early. Imogen sat across from me with Rupert beside her. My mother moved between the kitchen and the table. My father held the conversation together the way he always held things together, which was by asking questions that gave everyone something to respond to so nobody had to say anything real. Then Imogen put her glass down. She had been waiting. I understand that now in the way you understand things in retrospect that you should have seen coming but did not because you were focused on surviving the room rather than reading it. She looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has prepared a line and is delivering it in the register of casual observation. "At least I still have a husband." She said it with a small laugh that was meant to make it sound like nothing, like a throwaway, like something that had simply occurred to her in the moment rather than something she had decided before she walked through the door. My mother found something very important in her bread roll. My father looked at the table. Rupert's phone suddenly required his full attention. I picked up my wine glass. I took a sip. I set it down. I looked at my sister with the expression I had been practicing since October, which was no expression at all. The neutral face of someone who has decided that reacting is a form of losing and has removed that option from the available responses. Then I folded my napkin. I said goodnight to my parents. I picked up my coat. I drove home in the silence that was mine. That was the last time they saw me as the woman they expected me to still be. The next time they saw me, 6 months later, something had changed. Not dramatically, not in the way of a scene they could have prepared for, just quietly and completely, and in a direction none of them had accounted for. Because while they were watching me to see if I would fall apart, I had been doing something else entirely. And my sister was about to call me on a Tuesday, crying, asking a question that told me everything I needed to know about what she had been expecting. The question was simple. How are you affording this place? The flat in Swindon cost £750 a month. I know the exact number because I had built a spreadsheet the week I moved in that tracked every dollar coming in and every dollar going out with the specific precision of someone who has spent 6 years inside a financial arrangement she did not fully control and has decided that clarity is the first form of freedom available to her. The spreadsheet was not complicated. It was honest, which made it the most useful financial document I had produced in years. My salary from the consulting firm was £55,000 annually before bonuses. The divorce settlement had given me my share of the house equity, which after 6 years of appreciation and a favorable market came to a number that was not life-changing, but was substantial enough to matter if handled correctly. Giles had kept the investment accounts we had built together. I had kept my private pension, which I had been funding since I was 24, and which nobody had thought to factor into the negotiation as aggressively as they should have. That was a mistake on their side. I did not point it out. I just kept the account and closed the folder and drove to Swindon with 2 carloads of things I had chosen deliberately rather than accumulated accidentally, and I started the spreadsheet. The first thing I did with the settlement money was nothing. I sat with it for 30 days in a high-yield savings account, and I did not touch it, and I did not make decisions about it, and I did not tell anyone it existed. This was not strategic silence exactly. It was the specific caution of someone who has learned that the decisions made in the first 30 days after a significant life change are usually the decisions you spend the next several years correcting. I had made enough corrections. I was going to take my time. The flat had one feature that the listing had not emphasized because it was not the kind of feature that photographs well, quiet. Not the performed quiet of a house where 2 people are being careful around each other, the actual quiet of a space that belongs entirely to one person and requires nothing from that person except presence. I sat in it for the first 3 evenings after I moved in, and I did not turn on the television, and I did not call anyone, and I ate simple things at my kitchen table, and I read, and I thought, and I let the quiet be what it was. On the 4th evening, I cried for approximately 40 minutes. Not from grief about the marriage. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. I cried because I had not understood until I was sitting in genuine quiet how much noise I had been living inside. Not external noise. The internal noise of constant calibration of adjusting my opinions before I expressed them, of reading a room before I entered it, but of monitoring my own behavior for anything that might require explanation or correction or management. That noise was gone. The 40 minutes of crying was not about losing something. It was about understanding for the first time what I had been carrying. I called my mentor Miriam on a Thursday in late November. Miriam Khan was MT2, a former CFO who had transitioned to independent consulting 8 years earlier, and who had hired me as a junior analyst when I was 24, and had watched my career with the specific interest of someone who recognizes capability and finds it professionally satisfying to see what it does when given room. She had sent me a card when she heard about the divorce, not a sympathy card, a plain card with her handwriting inside. It said, "Call me when you are ready to talk about what comes next." I had waited 3 weeks before I called because I needed to have stopped grieving the performance of the marriage before I could talk clearly about the reality of what followed it. When I called, she answered on the second ring. She said, "How are you actually?" I said, "Better than I was supposed to be." She said, "Good. That means you are honest with yourself. That is the prerequisite for everything else." We talked for an hour. She asked about my financial position with the directness of someone who has spent 30 years in finance and understands that emotional well-being and financial clarity are not separate categories. I told her about the spreadsheet. I told her about the settlement. I told her about the private pension. She said, "You are in a better position than you think you are." I said, "I am beginning to understand that." She said, "I have a project that needs someone with your background. It is a 3-month consulting engagement with a healthcare organization in transition. The rate is significant. I need someone I trust. Do you want it?" I said yes before she finished the sentence. That was the first piece. The consulting engagement ran from January through March. The rate Miriam had described as significant was £120 an hour at 40 hours a week, which produced a number that, when it appeared in my bank account at the end of the first month, I looked at for a full minute before I moved on. I did the work the way I had always done work, which was thoroughly and precisely and without the ambient distraction of a personal life that required constant management. The quiet, flat, and the focused engagement and the absence of the specific energy drain of performing myself for someone else's comfort produced a quality of professional output that I had not been capable of in the last 2 years of /ins. My marriage, Miriam noticed. She referred me to 2 additional clients before the first engagement closed. By April, I had 3 concurrent consulting contracts and was working more hours than I had worked since my late 20s, and was not tired in the structural way I had been tired inside the marriage. I was tired in the productive way of someone whose energy is going somewhere that returns something. I increased the spreadsheet's complexity. I added a column for projected income across 6 months. I added a column for investment opportunities I was researching. I added a column labeled Beach House with a number in it that represented the deposit I would need and a projected timeline for when that number would be available. The beach house was not a dream, exactly. It was a target. I had been to Cornwall twice in my life, and both times I had stood on the deck of a rented house and felt the specific quality of that light on that water, and thought that this was the kind of peace people meant when they said they wanted to live differently. Giles had never wanted to go to Cornwall. He preferred destinations that photographed well and communicated something about the quality of the people who visited them. I had let that be the answer for 6 years. Meanwhile, the family's version of my life continued without significant update. My mother called on Sundays. The calls had a consistent structure. She would ask how I was doing in the tone that meant she was asking whether I was still embarrassing. I would say I was well. She would provide news about Imogen and Rupert, which she delivered with the ambient warmth of someone reporting on the family's representative success story. Imogen and Rupert had booked a holiday to the Algarve. Imogen and Rupert were renovating the kitchen. Rupert had been promoted, which was wonderful for Imogen. I said that was lovely and meant it without the edge she was probably checking for. My father called occasionally to ask direct questions about whether I needed anything. These calls were shorter and warmer, and I appreciated them without reading too much into them. Imogen texted every few weeks. The texts had a quality I had learned to read accurately. They were the texts of someone monitoring a situation they had expected to produce distress and finding the absence of visible distress confusing. She would send something casual. "How are you settling in? Any plans this summer?" The questions of someone who is performing friendly interest and also doing reconnaissance. I responded warmly and without detail. The detail was mine. In May, I made the first investment. A financial advisor named Desmond, who had been referred by Miriam's network and who had the specific quality of someone who listens to the full sentence before beginning to form a response. He reviewed my position across 2 meetings and then recommended a property investment trust with a track record and a fee structure I found acceptable after my own research. I put 30% of the settlement money into it. I kept 40% in the high-yield account as liquidity. I allocated the remaining 30% to a target I'd been researching since February. There was a property in Cornwall, a small beach house in a town called Mevagissey that had been sitting on the market for 11 weeks. 3 bedrooms, direct sea access, a deck that faced east. The asking price reflected the length of time it had been listed, and a seller who had already bought elsewhere and needed to close. I called Desmond. He said the numbers supported it. I called the estate agent that afternoon. I made an offer below, asking with a 30-day completion. The seller countered. I came up once, they accepted. The completion happened on a Thursday in June. I drove down alone the Friday after. 4 hours with the windows down and a playlist I had built over the winter of songs that had nothing to do with anyone else's taste. I pulled into the gravel driveway at 3:00 the afternoon and sat in the car for a moment the way I had learned to sit with significant moments before moving through them. The house was small and slightly weathered and smelled like salt and old wood and the specific warmth of a space that has been absorbing sunlight through its walls for years. The deck faced east. The sea was 6 meters from the bottom step. I made coffee in the kitchen using the equipment I had packed in a box in the boot, and I took it out to the deck, and I stood there in the late afternoon light with the water moving in the distance and the specific quiet of a place where nobody knew where I was or what I was doing or what they could expect from me. My phone had 3 notifications: a confirmation from Desmond about the investment trust distribution, a new consulting inquiry forwarded by Miriam, a text from my mother asking if I was coming to the family barbecue in July. I put the phone in my pocket. I held the coffee with both hands. I looked at the water. Imogen found out on a Tuesday. Not from me. From a mutual friend named Gemma who had seen a photograph I had posted on my private account. A morning shot of the deck with the sea in the background and a coffee cup in the foreground. Captioned simply, Mevajacy. Gemma had mentioned it to someone who had mentioned it to Imogen. I know this because of the specific sequence of Imogen's messages before she called. First, a casual text. Hey, are you at the beach this week? Then 20 minutes later, more direct. Wait, is that your house? Then 4 minutes after that, a call I let go to voicemail. Then a second call. I answered the second one. Her voice had the quality I had been expecting without knowing I was expecting it. Not anger, something more complicated than anger. The sound of someone whose internal map of a situation has just been handed geography that does not fit where they had placed everything. She said, "How are you affording this? Not congratulations, not that is beautiful, not I am happy for you. How are you affording this?" The question told me everything it needed to tell me about what she had believed the last 6 months had looked like for me. She had believed I was managing, surviving, holding together with the specific dignity of someone who has lost the thing that mattered and is too proud to admit how diminished the loss has left her. She had not believed I was building anything. She had been waiting to feel sorry for me, and the geography she had been given did not support that feeling, and she did not know what to do with the landscape that replaced it. I said, "I made some good decisions this year." Silence. Then quietly, with something underneath it that was not quite what it sounded like on the surface, she said, "I did not know you were doing this well." I said, "I know." I did not say anything else because the thing I had learned in 100 square meters of quiet in Swindon and in 3 months of work that returned more than it cost, and in a Thursday afternoon completion and a Friday drive with the windows down was this. The people who expected you to fail are never asking how you afforded the beach house. They are asking why you did not fail the way they needed you to, and that question does not have an answer you are required to provide. Imogen cried for 11 minutes. I know because I was standing on the deck with the phone against my ear and the sea doing what the sea does in the early evening, moving steadily and indifferently, and without any interest in the conversation happening above it. She cried the way people cry when they are confused about what they are actually crying about. Not clean grief, the complicated kind that arrives when the story you have been telling yourself about someone else's life turns out to be wrong, and the wrongness reflects something about your own story that you are not ready to examine. Illiter. Not because I was performing patience, because I had learned in the last 6 months that silence was not the absence of a response. It was a response. And in this case, it was the most honest one available. She said things in the way people say things when they are crying and not fully in control of the sequence, that she had not known, that she had assumed, that she had thought after the divorce I was struggling, and she had felt sorry for me, and now she did not know how to reorient, and it felt strange, and she was not sure what she was feeling. I said, I know. She said it did not seem fair. I said I understood why it felt that way. She said Rupert had been distant lately. She said it quickly, the way you say the real thing when you have been circling it for 11 minutes and the crying has worn down the usual filters. She said she did not know what distant meant exactly, but she knew what it felt like, and it felt like something she had been managing alone for a while. I said I was sorry to hear that. She said, do you ever think about the things you said at that dinner? I said, which dinner? She said, February. The Sunday roast dinner. I said, I think you mean the things you said. A pause. Then quietly, yes. I suppose I do. She did not apologize exactly. She arrived at the edge of an apology and stood there, which was the closest Imogen had come to one in the 33 years I had known her. And I did not push her across it because pushing her across it would have made it about me and what I needed from her, rather than about whatever she was working through on her own. I said I appreciated her calling. She said the beach house looked beautiful. I said it was. We said goodbye. I put the phone on the deck railing and looked at the water and thought about a conversation I had expected to feel like more than it did. I had spent 6 months building something real, and the moment of its discovery had arrived, and it was a phone call from a crying sister on a Tuesday, and then the sea in the evening, and then quiet. That was all it was. That was enough. The family's reorientation happened gradually across the summer. These things do not happen in a single moment the way stories sometimes want them to. They happen in the accumulation of small shifts that together constitute a change in the architecture of how people relate to each other. My mother called on the Sunday after Imogen told her about Mevajacy. The call was different from the Sunday calls that had preceded it in a way I noticed immediately and did not remark on. The quality of her attention was different. She asked about the house with a genuine curiosity that was not filtered through pity or assessment. She asked how many bedrooms and whether the deck faced the water, and whether I had found a good grocery store nearby. I answered the questions. She said it sounded lovely. I said it was. Then she said, I worry that I did not handle the last year well with you. I looked out the kitchen window at the gravel driveway and the seagrass moving in the wind beyond it. I said, I know it was hard to watch. She said, I was more concerned about what people would think than whether you were okay. That was not right. I said, no, it was not. She said, are you okay? I said, I am better than okay. I am exactly where I chose to be. A pause that had a different quality than the pauses that had preceded it all year. Not the pause of someone managing distance, the pause of someone receiving information and letting it settle. She said, I can see that now. I said, I know you can. We talked for 40 minutes about the house and about her garden, and about a book she had been reading, and about nothing that required either of us to perform a version of ourselves for the other's benefit. It was the most honest conversation we had had in years, and it was ordinary in the way that honest conversations are ordinary and extraordinary in the way that they are also that. My father drove down in August. He called 2 days before to ask if he could come and see the place, and I said yes, and he arrived on a Saturday morning in his Land Rover with a 4-pack of ale and a toolbox, because that is how my father expresses love through the offer of useful labor. He walked through the house without saying much. He checked the door hinges and the window seals and the crawl space access with the methodical attention of a spent 30 years in construction management, and cannot enter a building without assessing its condition. Then he came out onto the deck and stood beside me looking at the water. He said, You did this yourself. I said, Yes. He said, I did not give you enough credit. I said, You gave me what you knew how to give. He said, That is a generous way to say it. I said, It is also true. He opened 2 ales and handed me one, and we stood there for a while watching the water and not saying anything. And that was its own form of conversation between people who understand each other well enough to know that silence is not absence. Later, he fixed a loose board on the deck stairs without being asked, and I made lunch and we ate it at the table on the deck. and he told me about a project he was consulting on in retirement. And I told him about the healthcare work, and we talked about actual things in the way of two people who have finally given each other permission to be actual. He drove back that evening. Before he left, he hugged me in the driveway for longer than he usually did, and he said, "Your mother and I missed you this year. Not the version of you we were expecting, you." I said I knew. He got in the Land Rover. I watched him drive out. The sister story developed across the autumn in the way things develop when they have been developing beneath the surface for longer than anyone acknowledged. Rupert had been distant because Rupert had been elsewhere. The details came to me through Imogen over 2 phone calls in September and October, delivered with the specific rawness of someone who is processing something large and does not have many people she trusts enough to process it with. They were separating not dramatically in the quiet, procedural way that marriages end when both people have been honest enough with themselves to understand that continuing requires more performance than either of them has left. I listened. I did not say I understand in the way that would have implied a comparison. Our situations were different. Her marriage ending was not the same as mine ending, and the fact that I had navigated mine with a particular outcome did not make me an authority on hers. I said, "What do you need right now?" She said she did not know. I said, "That is okay. You do not have to know yet." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I do not know how you did this the first months. I do not know how you held it together." I said I did not hold it together. I let it be what it was, and I built something alongside the being of it. She said, "I said something terrible to you in February." I said, "You did." She said, "I am sorry." 2 words delivered without the architecture of justification around them. Just the words in their plain form. I said, "I know you are." She said, "Do you forgive me?" I thought about that question honestly rather than reflexively. Forgiveness is not a performance, and I had learned to distinguish between the two. I said, "I forgive you for saying it. I am still working out what to do with what it showed me about what you were thinking before you said it." She said, "That is fair." I said, "It is also something we can work on if you want to." She said, "I would like that." I drove back to Swindon in October for a client engagement that ran 3 weeks. The flat was still there, sublet to a postgraduate student who had left it cleaner than I had. I stayed in a short-term rental near the office and worked long hours in the focused way that had become the foundation of the year and drove down to Mevagissey on the weekends. The beach house in autumn was different from the beach house in summer, quieter. The tourist traffic gone, the light different, the water a darker shade, and the wind coming off it with more force. I liked it better in autumn. The summer version was beautiful. The autumn version felt true. Miriam called in October with a proposal for a longer engagement, a 1-2-month consulting arrangement with a healthcare system in transition that would represent the most significant professional commitment I had made since leaving the consulting firm 3 years earlier. I took 2 days to review the terms. I accepted on a Wednesday. I called Desmond the same day and reviewed the investment trust performance and discussed reallocating a portion toward a second property I had been watching, a small townhouse in Winchester that had the numbers Miriam's framework had taught me to look for. Desmond said the numbers worked. I said, "Let me think about it for 30 days. He said, "Of course." I put the phone down and opened the spreadsheet and added a column. 6 months after the beach house completed, I sat on the deck on an early morning in November with coffee and the sea, and the particular quiet of a day that has not yet decided what it will be. My phone had messages I had not read yet. Miriam about the engagement timeline, Desmond about the Winchester property, a text from Imogen asking if she could come to Mevagissey for a weekend in December, a Sunday call from my mother I had missed and would return later. I did not read any of them yet. I held the coffee and looked at the water, and I thought about a Sunday dinner in February and a line delivered with a small laugh meant to make it sound like nothing. At least I still have a husband. I thought about the drive home that night in silence, about the flat in Swindon and the spreadsheet and the quiet that had initially felt like emptiness and had turned out to be the first honest space I had occupied in years. My divorce had not ruined my life. It had ended the performance of a life and created room for the actual one. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is everything. Here is what happened, plainly. I left a marriage that had cost me more than it returned. I moved into a small flat and built a spreadsheet and called a mentor and took a consulting engagement and then another and then another. I sat with settlement money for 30 days before I touched it. I made one investment and then a second and kept clear records of both. I found a beach house with the right numbers and the right light, and I bought it on a Thursday in June and drove there alone on a Friday with the windows down. My sister called me crying on a Tuesday, asking how I afforded it. My mother apologized in the way mothers apologize when they finally locate the honest version of the thing they have been saying around. My father fixed a loose board on the deck stairs, and we ate lunch and talked about actual things. My sister is separating from her husband, and I am learning what it means to be her sister rather than her comparison point. That is the whole story. Now here is what I want to leave with you. The people who need you to fail are not your enemies. They are people whose self-assessment depends on where you place in a ranking they constructed without your input. When you stop participating in the ranking, not loudly, not with a speech, just by redirecting your energy towards something real, the ranking loses the thing it needed to function. You do not have to announce your departure. You just have to leave. The second thing is about peace. Peace does not photograph the way success does. It does not have the visual grammar that social media was built to carry. It looks like an empty deck in the early morning, and coffee going warm in your hands, and a spreadsheet with honest numbers, and a phone you have not checked yet. Some people will only understand your peace when it comes with a view they recognize as expensive. That is about their vocabulary, not your value. Build the thing anyway. The view is for you, not for them. Tell me in the comments your first name and your city. Tell me if you have ever had a room full of people waiting for you to fall apart and decided to build something instead. I want to know who is at this table tonight. Subscribe to Revenge Cold Stories if you want to be here for the next one.